The silence at Willow Point was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It was a rich, textured quiet, woven from the gentle lapping of lake water against the shore, the whisper of wind through the tall pines, and the distant, mournful cry of a loon. For Lena, this was the sound of her grandmother's soul. 3 weeks after the funeral, this 5-acre plot of lakeside land was the only place her grief felt manageable. She spent her weekends here, trading the hushed, scholarly dust of the university archive for the scent of pine needles and damp earth. The small, dilapidated cabin, nestled in a grove of birch trees, had been her project for the past year. Today, her task was replacing a rotted windowsill, a slow, methodical job that was more meditation than labor. As she worked, her hands moving with a practiced, patient rhythm, the memories came unbidden, as they always did. She saw her grandmother, Eleanor, 20 years younger, kneeling in this very spot, pointing out the delicate, bell-shaped flowers of a twin flower. Linnea borealis, her grandmother had whispered, her voice as soft as the moss they knelt on. Named for Carl Linnaeus, it needs the shade of these old trees to thrive. Some things are like that. They need a quiet place to grow. Her grandmother had been like that, a quiet, private woman who had cultivated a life of simple, profound beauty on this small patch of land. While her son, Marcus, had chased the loud, glittering promises of the city, Eleanor had stayed here, her roots sunk deep into the rocky soil of Willow Point. And she had shared its secrets only with Lena. Lena planed the edge of the new pine board, the wood shaving curling away in a perfect, fragrant spiral. She had poured her savings and her weekends into this place, into honoring the memory of the woman who had been her anchor. It was a sacrifice, she supposed. She could have been traveling, dating, building a life outside of her quiet job and this quiet piece of land. But it never felt like a sacrifice. It felt like coming home. The reading of the will, scheduled for the following Monday, felt like a harsh, unwelcome intrusion into her quiet morning. It was a formality, she assumed. Her uncle, Marcus, would inherit the land, of course. He was the son, the charismatic, successful developer who, despite visiting his mother only a handful of times in the last decade, was still the undisputed golden child of the family. Lena expected nothing, and for that reason, she was completely unprepared for the storm that was about to break. The lawyer's office was the complete antithesis of Willow Point. It was a sterile, airless space on the 12th floor of a city high-rise, smelling of leather and ambition. The only view was of other, taller glass and steel buildings. Lena, in her simple dark dress, felt small and out of place. Her uncle, Marcus, arrived precisely on time, looking every bit the part of the bereaved but important son. He was handsome, tanned, and dressed in a suit so expensive it seemed to have its own gravitational pull. He greeted her not with a hug, but with a cool, assessing glance. "Lena," he said, his voice a smooth, deep baritone. "Good to see you. Still hiding away in that dusty old library?" Before she could form a reply, he had turned his attention to the lawyer, Mr. Davies, and was already discussing the probate process with an air of bored expertise. He was not here to grieve. He was here to close a deal. They sat at the large, polished conference table, a heavy, uncomfortable silence settling between them. Mr. Davies, a kind, elderly man who had been her grandmother's lawyer for 40 years, cleared his throat and put on his glasses. "We are gathered to read the last will and testament of Eleanor Vance," he began, his voice formal. "This document was prepared and signed in my presence 2 years ago, and is, to my certain knowledge, her final and definitive will." Marcus leaned back in his chair, an expression of calm expectation on his face. He was the sole heir to the main event, the land. The rest was just paperwork. Mr. Davies read through the initial bequests, a donation to the local bird sanctuary, her collection of antique gardening books to the public library, her modest stock portfolio and the contents of her savings accounts, totaling some $50,000, were to be left to her son. "To my beloved son, Marcus," Mr. Davies read, I leave all my financial assets, in the hopes that they will bring him some small measure of the security he seeks." Marcus gave a small, self-satisfied nod, as if his mother had finally acknowledged his financial acumen. Lena felt a quiet pang of relief. It was a clean break. He had the money, she had the memories. And then Mr. Davies took a sip of water and continued to the final, most significant clause. "Regarding my real property," he read, his voice clear and steady, "the 5-acre plot and cabin known as Willow Point, located on the north shore of Silver Lake." He paused and looked over his glasses, first at Marcus, then at Lena. "To my beloved granddaughter, Lena, who has always known the true value of the land and shares my heart for its quiet beauty, I bequeath my property known as Willow Point, including the cabin and all its contents, to be hers and hers alone, to protect and to cherish as she sees fit." The words seemed to hang in the airless room, shimmering and impossible. Lena's mind struggled to catch up. The land. Her grandmother had left her the land, not Marcus, her. A tidal wave of love and shock and a profound, overwhelming sense of being truly seen by her grandmother washed over her, leaving her breathless. But the moment was shattered by a sharp, ugly sound from across the table. Marcus was staring at the lawyer, his charming, handsome face a mask of disbelief that was quickly contorting into a dark, mottled red of pure rage. The confident, entitled son had vanished, replaced by a petulant, furious boy who had just had his favorite toy taken from him. "That's it?" he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "She gets the land, and I get pocket money?" "Those were your mother's wishes, Marcus," Mr. Davies said calmly. "My mother was an 80-year-old woman," he shot back, his voice rising. "She was confused. She wasn't in her right mind." He turned his furious gaze on Lena, his eyes narrowed with a sudden, venomous suspicion. "What did you do?" he spat, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "What lies did you whisper in her ear when she was old and alone? Did you trick her into this?" Lena, still reeling from the shock of her inheritance, could only stare at him, speechless. "This is an insult," Marcus said, his voice shaking with a rage that seemed to be years in the making. He stood up, knocking his chair back with a loud clatter. He loomed over the table, a figure of pure, menacing fury. A joke. He pointed a trembling finger at Lena, his face just inches from hers. "You haven't heard the last of this, Lena." He turned and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him with a force that rattled the glass in the windows. He left behind a thick, vibrating silence, the echo of a declaration of war. Lena sat there, her heart hammering against her ribs, the beautiful, precious gift of her grandmother's love now feeling like a terrible, heavy, and dangerous burden. Her quiet, personal grief had just been invaded, and the peaceful sanctuary of Willow Point was now the battleground. The week following the reading of the will was a study in psychological warfare. Marcus, true to his word, did not let the matter rest. He began with a barrage of texts, each one a small, poisoned dart. "I hope you're happy with yourself. Everyone is talking about what you did. You've embarrassed the entire family. I'm giving you one last chance to do the right thing, Lena. Sign the land over to me before this gets ugly." Lena, still reeling from the shock of the inheritance and the ugliness of the confrontation, didn't know how to respond. She felt a toxic mix of guilt, as if she had done something wrong simply by being chosen, and a new, unfamiliar flicker of defiance. She showed the texts to her colleagues at the archive, who were universally horrified. "Don't you dare reply to that bully," her friend Maria said, her voice fierce. So, Lena remained silent, but her silence only seemed to enrage her uncle further. The official declaration of war was delivered by a courier to her at her place of work. The quiet, scholarly sanctuary of the university library was the last place she had expected such a hostile intrusion. She was in the rare books room, carefully cataloging a collection of 19th-century botanical illustrations, when the department secretary appeared at the door, a large, crisp legal envelope in her hand. "For you, Lena," she'd said, her eyes wide with a curiosity that made Lena's skin prickle, "by special courier." Lena took the envelope back to her small, quiet Carol, her heart pounding a heavy, fearful rhythm. She slid it open with the edge of a silver letter opener, a tool she normally used for delicate archival work. The document inside was thick, heavy, and cold to the touch. The language was a brutal, formal assault. "The plaintiff, Marcus Vance, alleges." She scanned the pages, the legal jargon like a foreign language designed to intimidate and confuse, but the meaning, in its horrifying simplicity, was clear. Undue influence, exploitation of a vulnerable elder, the deceased's testamentary capacity was compromised due to age and infirmity. It was a formal, public declaration that her relationship with her grandmother, the purest and most important relationship of her life, had been a lie. It painted her as a conniving, manipulative predator, and her strong, sharp-witted grandmother as a doddering, senile victim. It was an act of profound character assassination, legally notarized and delivered to her doorstep. This was the last straw. The ugly threat had metastasized into a formal, public war, and she had just been served her enlistment papers. That night, her small, quiet apartment felt like a cage. The lawsuit sat on her coffee table, a venomous white paper snake, its presence poisoning the air. She couldn't eat, she couldn't read, she could only pace, her mind a frantic, looping reel of worst-case scenarios. She did what any archivist would do. She researched. She spent hours online, falling down a rabbit hole of legal articles about contested wills and probate litigation. She read about discovery phases, depositions, and the staggering cost of legal fees. Her uncle was a wealthy developer with a team of ruthless corporate lawyers on retainer. She was a librarian with a modest salary and a savings account she had been slowly depleting to restore her grandmother's cabin. A wave of utter, hopeless despair washed over her. She couldn't win this. He would bury her in legal fees, drag her name and her grandmother's memory through the mud, and in the end, he would win because he had more money and more power. The family's unspoken rule, the one she had lived under her whole life, screamed in her mind, "Marcus always gets what he wants." Maybe it was easier to just give in, to sign the land over, to make the nightmare stop. The thought was a bitter pill, a surrender of everything she held dear. But the alternative, a long, ugly, and financially ruinous public battle, seemed infinitely worse. She felt the fight draining out of her, replaced by a familiar, weary resignation. This was her lot in life, to be the quiet, overlooked one who eventually, always, had to give way to her uncle's desires. The next morning, on the verge of calling Marcus to surrender, she made one last, desperate call. Her friend from her monthly book club had often mentioned her husband, Ben, was a lawyer. Not a corporate shark like her uncle's attorneys, but a small-town lawyer who handled wills and property disputes. She asked if he would be willing to just look at the lawsuit, to give her some advice. She met Ben at a local coffee shop. He was a kind, thoughtful man with a calm demeanor that immediately put her at ease. He listened patiently as she recounted the story, his expression shifting from sympathy to a kind of quiet, righteous anger. He read the lawsuit, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he was done, he set the papers down and looked at her, his gaze steady and serious. "This is a classic bully tactic, Lena," he said, his voice firm. "He knows he probably can't win on the legal merits. A clearly written will is hard to overturn. So he's using his money and power to try and scare you into submission before it even gets to court. He's counting on you folding because you can't afford the fight." "I can't," she whispered, the admission a painful lump in her throat. "I can't afford it." "We'll figure that part out," Ben said, waving a dismissive hand. "We can file for a summary judgment. We can countersue for legal fees if he's acting in bad faith. We have legal moves we can make." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "But that's their game, Lena, the courtroom. We need to play our game. You're an archivist. You find and preserve the truth. His entire case is built on a single poisonous lie, that your grandmother was mentally incompetent and that you manipulated her." He tapped a finger on the table for emphasis. "The best defense against that isn't a better legal argument, it's a better story, the true story. You knew her better than anyone. He hasn't seen her more than a handful of times in the last 10 years. You have the advantage." He looked at her, his words a challenge and an invitation. "So go back. Go through everything, every letter, every journal, every calendar she ever kept. Find anything and everything that proves she was of sound mind, that she was making her own choices. And more importantly, find anything that shows the world why she would give the land to you and not to him. The truth is your best weapon. Go find it." Ben's words were a lifeline. The despair that had been threatening to drown her began to recede, replaced by a new, unfamiliar sense of purpose. He had not just offered her legal advice, he had handed her back her own identity. She was not a helpless victim. She was a researcher. She was an archivist, and she had an archive to build. That afternoon, she drove to her grandmother's house. The air inside was still and thick with the scent of old paper and dried lavender. It was no longer just a house filled with memories. It was a primary source, an archive waiting to be processed. Her uncle's lawyers would be sending discovery requests, demanding access to her grandmother's financial and medical records. But her grandmother's heart, her motivations, her story, that was not in any official file. It was here, in the quiet, dusty rooms of her life. She stood at the bottom of the narrow staircase leading to the attic, a room she hadn't entered in years. Her grandmother had called it her memory room, a place where she kept the unsorted, chaotic overflow of a long and quiet life. It was a daunting, overwhelming prospect. Boxes upon boxes of letters, photographs, and journals. But as she stood there, the key to the attic door clutched in her hand, she was no longer afraid. Her grief was still a raw, open wound, but now it was mingled with a fierce, protective resolve. Her uncle had attacked her grandmother's memory, and she was the only one left to defend it. This was not just a legal battle anymore. It was a sacred trust. She unlocked the door, the click of the old lock echoing in the silent house. A dusty, slanted ray of afternoon light cut through the gloom, illuminating a world of forgotten stories. She took a deep, steadying breath, rolled up her sleeves, and stepped across the threshold. The investigation had begun. The attic of her grandmother's house was not a dusty, forgotten space. It was an archive, meticulously disorganized, a lifetime of memories packed into steamer trunks, cedar chests, and cardboard boxes labeled in her grandmother's elegant, fading script. For Lena, stepping into it was like entering the vault of a library dedicated to a single, precious subject, the life of Eleanor Vance. Her lawyer's words had given her a new, critical purpose. She was no longer just a grieving granddaughter sorting through keepsakes. She was an archivist on a mission, searching for the evidence that would protect her grandmother's final wishes. She began her work with the methodical patience of her profession. She set up a long folding table under the single bare bulb that hung from the rafters and put on a pair of white cotton gloves. She started with the letters, dozens of neat bundles tied with faded silk ribbon. She read through decades of correspondence, her grandmother's sharp wit and keen observations painting a vivid picture of a woman who was anything but mentally frail. The letters were a testament to a lucid, engaged mind right up to the final months of her life. This, Lena knew, would be invaluable. Next, she turned to the journals. Her grandmother had kept a diary for over 60 years. They were not filled with emotional confessions, but with quiet, detailed observations of the natural world at Willow Point. May 12th, the first loon has returned to the cove. July 20th, the wild blueberries are coming in early this year. It was the chronicle of a woman deeply in tune with her surroundings. But as Lena sorted the journals chronologically, she discovered a strange and unsettling gap. There were consistent, detailed entries from 1965 up until the summer of 1975. Then, for 3 solid years, there was nothing. The entries picked up again in 1978, but their tone was different, quieter, more subdued, tinged with a melancholy that hadn't been there before. 3 years of silence. For a woman who had documented her life so faithfully, it was a profound and screaming void. The first clue to what lay in that void came from a battered shoebox simply labeled Photographs, Misk. It was filled with loose, black and white snapshots from her grandmother's youth. Lena was sifting through them when she found a picture that made her pause. It was a family portrait from what looked like the early 1970s. Her grandmother and grandfather stood behind 2 children. One was a handsome, charismatic boy of about 13, a younger version of the uncle she knew. The other was a small, bright-eyed girl with dark pigtails, a gap-toothed smile, and a mischievous glint in her eye. Lena had never seen her before. She flipped the photo over. There were no names, just a date stamp from a photo lab, August 1973. Who was this girl? In every family story, every holiday gathering, every conversation she could ever remember, Marcus had been an only child. With a strange chill creeping up her spine, Lena went back to the journals, to the entries just before the 3-year silence. Her hands shaking slightly, she began to read. And there she was. Marcus and Rosie, the entry for May 5th, 1975 read, "He spent the entire afternoon teaching her how to skip stones on the lake. He is so boisterous, and she is so small. I worry he plays too rough." Rosie. Her name appeared again and again in those final, happy entries. Rosie picked a bouquet of wild lupine for the table. Rosie is convinced she can talk to the squirrels. Then, after an entry dated July 11th, 1975, the entries stopped. The rest of the journal was blank. When the next volume picked up in 1978, there was never another mention of the name Rose. This was the moment of fragmentation. The realization was a slow, dawning horror that settled over her like a physical weight. Her grandmother had another child, a daughter, a sister her uncle had never, ever mentioned, a little girl who had vanished from the family's history, erased as completely as if she had never existed. The weight of this secret, this immense, unspoken grief that had been sitting at the heart of her family for her entire life, was crushing. This was not just about a property dispute anymore. This was about a ghost. Lena spent the next few days in a state of profound emotional turmoil. She felt like an intruder, an unwilling archaeologist who had unearthed a sacred, painful tomb. The lawsuit, which had seemed so monumental just a week ago, now felt like a petty, insignificant squabble in the face of this immense hidden tragedy. Who was she to stir up this old, deep pain, all for a piece of land? She hit rock bottom on a rainy Thursday afternoon in her own apartment, surrounded by the boxes she had brought back from the attic. She was holding the photograph of the little girl with the gapped-toothed smile, and she felt a wave of despair so profound it almost made her physically ill. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe the land should be his. Maybe selling it, erasing the place where this terrible, unspoken thing had happened, was the only way to let the ghost rest. She was ready to call Ben, to tell him to drop the case, to surrender. She was too small for a secret this big. But her archivist soul, the part of her that believed in the quiet power of the complete story, wouldn't let her. The gap was still there. She didn't have the whole truth yet. Driven by a new, grim purpose, not just to win a lawsuit, but to understand, she went back to the attic one last time. She focused her search on the photo albums from that specific era. At the bottom of a heavy cedar trunk beneath a stack of her grandmother's old quilts, she found it. It was a small, velvet-covered album, its pages stiff with age. The spine was unlabeled. She opened it. The album was dedicated to a single summer, 1975. Page after page showed a happy, sun-drenched family at Willow Point. Marcus, a handsome, confident teenager. Rose, a vibrant, happy 7-year-old. They were swimming, building sandcastles, roasting marshmallows. It was a perfect, idyllic family vacation captured in faded Kodachrome. She turned to the very last page. There was only one photograph tucked into the yellowing cellophane sleeves. It was slightly overexposed, the afternoon sun a little too bright. The image was so full of life, it was almost painful to look at. A 15-year-old Marcus stood at the very end of the long wooden dock, his body twisted, his head turned back toward the person holding the camera, her grandmother. He was laughing, a wide, careless, joyful laugh. His arm was outstretched, caught in the exact motion of a playful shove. And just beyond his hand, suspended for an eternal photographic instant in midair, was his little sister, Rose. Her small body was a blur of motion, her face a perfect O of surprise and laughter as she tumbled towards the sparkling water of the lake. It was the most innocent of moments, a brother and sister at play on a perfect summer day. Lena's archivist instincts, the ingrained need to check every detail, took over. With trembling hands, she used a pair of tweezers to carefully slide the photograph from its sleeve. On the back, in her grandmother's familiar, elegant script, was a single, devastating sentence. The ink faded with the passage of 40 years. July 12, 1975. The moment before. If only he had been watching her. This was it. The quiet, heartbreaking, and absolute proof. The whole terrible story was contained in those 10 words. Rose had drowned that day, and her grandmother, the one holding the camera, had preserved the final, innocent moment, and had privately, on the back of the image, recorded the silent, lifelong burden of blame she had placed on her son. It hadn't been a malicious act. It had been a moment of youthful carelessness, a sin of omission. If only he had been watching her. But in a mother's grieving heart, it was an unforgivable, life-altering negligence. Lena stared at the photograph, her own tears blurring the image of the laughing children. She finally understood everything. The will wasn't an act of senility or spite. It was her grandmother's final, silent judgment. She could never, ever leave the sacred, haunted ground where she had lost her daughter to the son she held responsible for that loss. It hadn't been a malicious act. It had been a moment of youthful carelessness, a sin of omission. If only he had been watching her. But in a mother's grieving heart, it was an unforgivable, life-altering negligence. Lena stared at the photograph, her own tears blurring the image of the laughing children. She finally understood everything. The will wasn't an act of senility or spite. It was her grandmother's final, silent judgment. She could never, ever leave the sacred, haunted ground where she had lost her daughter to the son she held responsible for that loss. The fragmentation was over. The awakening was complete. Lena was no longer just a niece fighting for a piece of land. She was the sole keeper of her grandmother's deepest secret and the silent, unknowing executor of her final, heartbreaking wish. Deliver this with the warm, polished, and confident tone of a professional female storyteller, similar to a host on an NPR or narrative podcast. The pacing must be fluid and conversational, not slow. Use natural, engaging intonation to tell the story effectively while avoiding any theatrical drama. The morning after her discovery, Lena met Ben at his office. The small, faded photograph and the relevant diary pages were nestled in an archival, acid-free folder. She felt a somber gravity, not the triumphant thrill of a smoking gun, but the heavy responsibility of a historian handling a delicate and explosive artifact. Ben read the diary entries first, his expression growing more serious with each page. Then, Lena slid the photograph across the desk. He picked it up carefully, studied the image of the two laughing children on the dock, and then turned it over to read the heartbreaking inscription in Eleanor's hand. He set it down gently, a long, slow breath escaping his lips. "My God," he said quietly. He looked at Lena, his gaze full of a new, profound understanding. "This doesn't prove anything illegal, Lena, but it proves everything personal. This is the story of her state of mind. It isn't a legal document, but in a courtroom, presented correctly, it's a tactical nuke. It completely reframes the narrative. It turns his claim of undue influence on its head. This will gives her a voice, and this," he tapped the photo, "is what she wanted to say." Armed with this sad, terrible truth, Lena felt a subtle but profound shift within herself. The fear that had haunted her for weeks did not vanish, but it was overshadowed by a new, quiet confidence. She was no longer just defending a piece of land. She was defending her grandmother's final, silent testament. The distant war of the legal process intensified. Marcus's lawyer, an aggressive attorney from the city named Mr. Hayes, began flooding Ben's office with discovery requests. They demanded years of Lena's personal financial records, phone logs, emails, anything and everything they could use to weave a narrative of a lonely, manipulative woman who had systematically isolated and exploited her elderly grandmother. Lena, with Ben's guidance, complied with every request calmly and methodically. She spent hours in her apartment, a place that now felt like a legal command center, gathering and organizing the documents of her own quiet, unassuming life. The process, which was designed to be intrusive and intimidating, had the opposite effect. As she printed out her modest bank statements and emails, filled mostly with correspondence with her colleagues at the archive and orders for cabin supplies, she saw a life of simple, honest work. There was no conspiracy, there was no manipulation, there was only the quiet, documented truth. Her new, unshakable calm seemed to unnerve the opposing counsel. They were used to dealing with defendants who were either emotionally overwrought or defensively aggressive. Lena was neither. She was simply maddeningly composed. She knew a truth that they didn't, a truth that had nothing to do with bank records. The real evidence was locked away safely in Ben's office, waiting. The deposition was held in a sterile, soulless conference room in a downtown office building. Lena sat at one side of a long, polished table with Ben. Across from them sat Marcus, his face a mask of arrogant impatience, and his lawyer, Mr. Hayes, who arranged his files with the precise, predatory movements of a surgeon laying out his scalpels. A court stenographer sat at the end of the table, her presence a reminder that every word spoken would be recorded, a permanent part of the official record. For 3 excruciating hours, Mr. Hayes subjected Lena to a relentless, grueling interrogation. His questions were designed to paint her as an opportunistic caregiver, a lonely spinster who had seized her chance to get rich. "Ms. Vance," he began, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "isn't it true that in the final 5 years of her life, you were your grandmother's sole and primary companion?" The implication was clear. She had isolated Eleanor. "My grandmother and I were very close, yes," Lena answered, her voice even. "My uncle lived several hundred miles away." "And during these years of closeness," Hayes continued, his fingers forming air quotes, "did you ever discuss her will with her? Did you perhaps advise her on her finances or the disposition of her assets?" "No," Lena said simply. "We discussed books and birds and the gardens at Willow Point. Her finances were her own business. A business from which you benefited handsomely, Hayes shot back. You accepted the deed to a property worth, by my client's estimation, upwards of $500,000. Did you ever think that seemed unfair to her only son, my client? Lena looked not at the lawyer, but at her uncle. For the first time, she met his gaze directly, and she did not flinch. I didn't think about whether it was fair, she said, her voice quiet, but ringing with a profound, unshakable honesty. I only thought that it was what my grandmother wanted, and I was honored that she trusted me with the place she loved most. Her calm, simple truth was more effective than any legal maneuvering. It made Hayes's aggressive questioning seem bullying and cruel. With every quiet, honest answer, she was not just defending herself. She was painting a portrait of her grandmother as a strong, independent woman who had known her own mind. Marcus grew increasingly agitated, shifting in his chair, his confident smirk slowly dissolving into a frustrated scowl. His narrative was crumbling, and he could feel it. The deposition concluded, and Mr. Hayes looked like a man who had just lost a fight he had been certain he would win. He had not landed a single effective blow. As he began to pack his briefcase with a frustrated snap, Ben made his quiet, strategic move. He stood up and addressed the opposing counsel, his tone casual, but with an underlying edge of steel. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I appreciate your time today. And just so you are aware as we move forward, in our own discovery process, we have unearthed some new evidence." Marcus, who had been about to leave, froze. Ben continued, his gaze fixed on the lawyer. "It's of a deeply personal and sensitive nature, including family photographs and private diary entries. We believe this evidence is highly relevant to the deceased's state of mind and her motivations regarding the disposition of the Willow Point property. We believe it will definitively explain her choices, and we will, of course, be submitting it all for discovery next week as required." The words hung in the air, a veiled but unmistakable threat. Marcus's face went pale. "What evidence?" he demanded, his voice suddenly sharp with a new, specific kind of fear. "What photos? What diaries?" Mr. Hayes put a restraining hand on his client's arm. "We will address this through the proper channels, Marcus," he said, though he too looked rattled, blindsided by this unexpected development. That evening, Lena was in her apartment, feeling the deep, bone-weary exhaustion that follows a major battle. She had survived. She had held her ground. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Her phone rang, the screen displaying an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Lena?" It was Marcus, but his voice was completely different. The arrogant, booming baritone was gone, replaced by a raw, ragged urgency. He sounded like a man standing on the edge of a precipice. "What did you find?" he demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. "What photos? My mother's diaries. What did they say?" He took a shaky breath. "I want to see you. I want to see this evidence myself, alone, before this goes any further." His words were a demand, but his tone was a plea. He was no longer a predator trying to intimidate her into submission. He was a haunted man, terrified that a ghost he had been running from his entire life was about to be summoned into the light. Lena stood in the quiet of her apartment, the phone pressed to her ear. The power had completely and irreversibly shifted. The meeting was set for the following Monday in Ben's conference room. It was neutral ground, but as Lena walked in, she knew that for the first time in her life, she was the one who held the power. Her uncle and his lawyer, Mr. Hayes, were already seated, a tangible aura of tense, impatient energy radiating from them. Marcus was trying to project his usual air of arrogant control, but it was strained, like a poorly fitting suit. The fear she had seen in his eyes over the phone was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. Lena was calm. The frantic, heart-pounding anxiety of the past few months had been replaced by a somber, quiet resolve. She was not here for revenge. She was not here for a fight. She was here as her grandmother's archivist, to present a single, crucial document from the collection. She sat down opposite her uncle, placed a slim, archival-quality folder on the polished table, and waited. "All right, Lena, let's get this over with," Marcus began, his voice a low, blustering attempt to regain control. "My lawyer has advised me that these kinds of last-minute discoveries are usually nothing more than desperate theatrics. So what is it? Some forged letter? A half-remembered conversation you've twisted into something it's not? Show us this evidence so we can all move on." Lena didn't respond to his words. She looked at Ben, who gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. She opened the folder. Inside was a single, high-quality 8x10 copy of the photograph, its colors professionally restored, its details sharp and clear. She took it out, the stiff photographic paper cool against her fingertips. She didn't say a word. She simply slid it across the polished surface of the conference table. It stopped directly in front of Marcus. The climax of her family's history, the fulcrum on which everything had turned, was not a shout, but a whisper. It was a silent, visual truth. Marcus looked down at the photograph, his expression first one of annoyance, then of simple, nostalgic recognition. It was just an old photo from the lake. He saw his own youthful, handsome face, laughing in the summer sun. He saw the old wooden dock, the sparkling water. For a split second, a faint, wistful smile touched his lips. Then, as was only natural, he picked up the photograph to get a closer look. And he turned it over. He saw the familiar, elegant, cursive script of his mother's handwriting. He saw the date, a date he had spent 40 years trying to forget. And he read the 10 words that had secretly defined his entire life. July 12th, 1975. The moment before, if only he had been watching her. The change that came over him was not dramatic. It was a quiet, horrifying collapse. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pale, waxy, grayish tint. His arrogant posture, the physical manifestation of his lifelong entitlement, dissolved. He slumped back in his expensive leather chair as if the bones had been removed from his body. The photograph slipped from his numb fingers and fluttered back onto the table. He stared at it, at the image of the laughing, carefree boy he had once been, and the little sister who had vanished from his life in the silent, shimmering water just moments after this picture was taken. He stared at his mother's words, a quiet, eternal indictment written in the ink of a grief he had never allowed himself to face. He slowly lifted his gaze and looked at Lena, and in his eyes, for the very first time, she saw not his weak, quiet niece, but something else. She was the keeper of his truth, the archivist of his deepest, most profound failure. He knew, with a sudden and devastating certainty, that she would not use the photo to shame him publicly, to expose him as a monster. That wasn't her way. But he also knew, with that same certainty, that she would absolutely use it in court. She would tell the true, heartbreaking story of their grandmother's state of mind, of a grief so deep it had shaped her final act on earth, and the shame of having that private, sacred sorrow dissected in a public courtroom, of having his sister's ghost summoned to serve his own greed, was more than he could bear. A long, heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. Ben and Mr. Hayes were perfectly still, two lawyers who suddenly understood that the legal case had just been rendered completely and utterly irrelevant by a judgment that had been passed down decades ago. Marcus finally found his voice. It was not a shout, but a choked, ragged whisper, the sound of a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. He looked at his own lawyer, a man whose services he no longer required. "It's over," he said. "Withdraw the lawsuit. Withdraw everything." He pushed his chair back, his movements clumsy, and stood on unsteady legs. He could not look at Lena again. He turned and walked out of the conference room, a man suddenly decades older, a ghost finally acknowledging the haunting he had spent a lifetime running from. Mr. Hayes, after a moment of stunned silence, began to pack his briefcase with a quiet, defeated efficiency. "You'll have the official withdrawal notice by the end of the day, Mr. Clark," he said to Ben, and then he too was gone. Lena sat in the quiet, empty room, a profound sense of peace settling over her. Justice had not been loud. It had been a faded photograph, a mother's secret sorrow, and the quiet, unyielding power of the truth. Epilogue, 1 year later. The late summer air at Willow Point was sweet with the scent of pine and chamomile. The old, dilapidated cabin was gone, replaced by a new structure, built with the same simple, elegant lines, but with wide, welcoming windows that let in the light. A beautifully carved wooden sign hung by the front door, the letters burned into the wood. The Eleanor and Rose Cabin, a retreat for quiet work. Lena stood on the porch, a cup of tea in her hand, watching a young poet sit on the end of the dock, a notebook open on her lap. The poet was the first resident of the retreat Lena had created. After the lawsuit was withdrawn, she had clear title to the land and the modest financial assets her grandmother had left her. She had used all of it to honor the two women whose story had defined the place. She had turned a site of private, unspoken grief into a sanctuary for peace and creation. She had not heard from her uncle since the day he had walked out of the lawyer's office. She had simply received the legal documents, and then silence. She hoped, in a quiet corner of her heart, that he had finally begun his own archival work, sorting through the painful, unexamined boxes of his own memory. The poet on the dock looked up from her work and smiled at Lena, a smile of pure, unadulterated peace. Lena smiled back. She looked out at the calm, sparkling lake, the same lake that had been the site of so much pain. But now, as the sun began to set, casting a golden, shimmering path across its surface, it was just a lake. The ghosts were at peace. She took a sip of her tea, the warmth spreading through her. Her own story had been written, the archives were in order, and she was finally, completely home.